Good evening. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm going to hold the microphone. My name is Jessica MacPhail. I'm the library director, and I'm so pleased that you're here with me to celebrate the very first Indigenous Peoples Day in the city of Racine. I'm going to take a minute and read out loud the resolution that was approved by the City Council. Indigenous Peoples Day began in commemoration of 500 years of survival and renewal of Native cultures in the face of political and cultural repression. The indigenous cultures flourishing in Racine since time immemorial established sustainable, accommodating cultures based on cooperation among neighbors and respect for the land and for all creatures living on it. These indigenous cultures were disrupted and destroyed in what is now Racine, as almost all parts of this hemisphere, and yet with great resilience they have survived. With at least 12,000 years of human occupation, today parts of Racine may have been built on sacred ground. The population in this area has transformed from a 100% indigenous society to a society with a 1% native population. The Indigenous Peoples Day recognition will bring greater understanding to the people of Racine regarding Native nations and cultures and the enormous contributions they have made and continue to make to world culture and to Racine. Now here is the wording of the proclamation which was approved by the city. Whereas Christopher Columbus, financed by Spain, landed in the Bahamas, not North America. And whereas Barcelona council members want to take down the statue of Christopher Columbus in the town center, arguing that it inappropriately celebrates the explorer's colonial history, and they are also calling for the city to stop celebrating a national Spanish holiday. And whereas Wisconsin is home to members of 11 federally recognized tribes, and indigenous peoples were here long before the first European explorers. And whereas the idea of Indigenous Peoples Day was first proposed in 1977 by a delegation of Native nations to the United Nations-sponsored International Conference on Discrimination Against Indigenous Populations in the Americas. And whereas the National Congress of American Indians formally endorsed support of Indigenous Peoples Day in 2011, and I'm quoting what they said, to enlighten the public toward a better understanding of the Indian people, to preserve Indian cultural values, and otherwise promote the health, safety, and welfare of the Indian people. And whereas communities around the country have since begun to formally recognize the observance of Indigenous Peoples Day in an effort to create a path of healing and reconciliation, including Milwaukee County and Dane County. And whereas Racine recognizes that it was founded and built upon lands first inhabited by Indigenous peoples of the Archaic period, and last by the Potawatomi tribe, until their removal in the 1830s under the Indian Removal Act. And whereas Racine recognizes the historic and contemporary cultural significance of the indigenous peoples and their ancestors, their knowledge, labor, technology, science, philosophy, arts, and many other contributions. And whereas Racine acknowledges the systemic racism toward indigenous peoples in the United States, which perpetuates high rates of poverty and income inequality. Now therefore be it resolved that the city of Racine does hereby affirm and proclaim that the second Monday of October will be Indigenous Peoples Day. And be it further resolved that the city of Racine does hereby offer its thanks and gratitude to the Native people on behalf of all of Racine in recognition of their care for this land and in honor of Native thought, culture, technology, and ways of being. And be it further resolved that the City of Racine includes recognition of this day in all its materials and calendars. Be it finally resolved that the City of Racine urges all of Racine community members to observe the second Monday in October as Indigenous Peoples Day. Today is October 8th, 2018, the very first celebration of this important day. And I'm so proud to be here celebrating and recognizing it with you. Our speakers today are Heather Bruegl. She's a graduate of Madonna University in Michigan and holds a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts in U.S. History. Inspired by a trip to Wounded Knee, South Dakota, a passion for Native American history was born. Heather calls Michigan home and currently travels and speaks on Native American history, including policy and activism. Maria Morales has been an advocate for migrant workers, immigration rights, and the Latinx community for more than, can I say it, 50 years. Ms. Morales has worked with Voces de la Frontera and the Urban League. She was recently recognized by the University of Wisconsin-Parkside for the impact she has made on southeastern Wisconsin and beyond with her social justice work. Please help me welcome Maria Morales.
I'm going kind of slow. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. As you know, my name is Maria Morales, and I was born in Texas, raised here in Racine. And I want to thank all of you for being here. I especially want to thank Jessica because she's the instigator here who started this. I just followed along. But as I said, I was born in Texas. My father was born in Durango, Mexico. He was of the Indigenous people. His people moved back and forth of what is now southwestern states and northern Mexico. But because he was born south of the border, we are Mexicans. My mother was born in Texas, as were all her people for centuries. But because she was born north of the river, we are Americans. And though my ancestors, many of them came from Spain in 1492, and we all know 1492. I cringe whenever I hear the name Columbus. Our schools have never taught the truth of what our people have had to endure, the real history of the people of the land. We are the true natives of the land, the survivors, the indigenous, from the union of Cortés and the Malinche, from Columbus' crew and our beautiful Caribbean princesses. We are the people of the land, our land. We survived Christopher Columbus' explorers, his conquistadores. We have survived Plymouth Rock, our founders, our pilgrims. We have survived our Davy Crockett's, our Daniel Boone's, the kings of the wild frontier. We survived the battles that the U.S. government placed upon our people. Custer's Last Stand, the Battle of Bighorn, Wounded Knee, the Trail of Tears, and many, many others. We've survived the settlers, the pioneers, gold diggers, land grabbers, and we have survived the attack on our lands. We have survived the attack on our language, our culture, our religion, and we will survive the kidnapping of our children, the torture of our people, the militarization of our borders, our lands. And we will survive the takeover of our lands, our mountains, and our rivers by the current administration. Our ways will remain for always, but we will strive to live in harmony with all our brothers and sisters. Thank you.
I don't know how to follow that. That was really, really amazing and inspiring. Let me just start this slideshow for you guys. So my name is Heather Bruegl. Some of you have heard me speak before. I was just in Racine in August. I think, was I here in August? Okay, I was here in August. Some people recognize me. And I was asked to come back and speak for Indigenous Peoples Day. And of course, because it's our day. So thank you, Racine, for making this part of your culture and your history now. So following up to the amazing speaker before me, I just wanted to talk about resilience and resistance. First by saying that in 1492, when Columbus was discovered off the shores of the Caribbean, life for Native Americans would never be the same. He was actually sent out to find a new route to Asia, but he wasn't good at his job, and so he ended up ending up in the Bahamas. So for anything, you don't want to celebrate Columbus Day because he didn't know where he was going, okay? So he wasn't good at his job, you guys. He encountered a group of indigenous peoples that he first described as friendly. He quoted in his diary as saying, "They were very well built, with very handsome bodies and very good faces. They do not carry arms or know them. They should be good servants." So that's the first thing he said about us when he first encountered us, is that we would make good servants. Well, we showed him. He was convinced that he found Asia, so he went back to Spain, and he, tried to get more trips here to discover more areas. When he returned back to the Caribbean, he found that the settlement that he had been destroyed, and the sailors had been massacred. And he was convinced it was the work of the indigenous peoples there. So he ended up forcing them into labor and rebuilt the settlement and used them to find gold as well. That didn't help relations between Columbus and the indigenous peoples there. It just built animosity towards them. So he died in 1506, still believing that he found the route to Asia, but he never did. He never once landed in America. He landed in the Caribbean. He bragged in his diaries about the treatment of the indigenous population that he encountered. He enslaved them from the beginning. He gave permission for his men to pillage villages, rape women, enslave the people. He basically used it as a way of getting back at the people. And he actually also participated in his own form of human trafficking by selling Native women to his crew to be used for pleasure. Again, there is a federal holiday recognizing this guy. But not in Racine anymore. It's Indigenous Peoples Day, yay! So the struggle for Indigenous Peoples Day has been around since the 1970s, as we learned earlier. It was first brought up to the UN as having a celebration there. The Bay Area Indian Alliance was formed and in Berkeley, California, and Berkeley's been celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day since 1992, which was the 500th anniversary of Columbus sailing to the New World, and it was also declared the Year of the Indigenous People. There have been many other states, including Minnesota, Alaska, and Vermont, and South Dakota, who celebrate Native American Day or Indigenous Peoples Day. They don't celebrate Columbus Day at all. And then this year we have Racine. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk to you guys about, I wanted to talk about the word that I picked to describe 2018 for me is resilience. It's coming back, so it's my word of 2018. And so I said, what can be my word, or what can I talk about? And I wanted to talk about the resilience of our people from the very beginning. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is some people look at it as a good thing, some people look at it as a bad thing, but one of the things that we survived was reservations. They weren't formed with good intentions. So there are 562 federally recognized tribes in the United States, with 229 located in Alaska, and the rest in 33 states across the United States. A reservation is a legally designated area of land that is managed by a Native American tribe under the jurisdiction of the BIA, and not by the state government. So the state governments don't have any say in reservations. The first reservation was established in 1851 in Oklahoma, which was then called Indian Territory. Not every tribe has a reservation, though. While some share land with others, the largest reservation in the United States is actually the Navajo Reservation. It takes up a lot of land. The majority of the amount of land, reservation land in the United States would take up just the state of Idaho. So we once roamed the whole continent, and now all the land that is federally designated to us would only take up Idaho. Majority of the reservations are west of the Mississippi. Some people look at the American Revolution, the War of Independence, not just a war against Great Britain, but a war against Native Americans, because we were there first. Right. It is our land. Speaking as a member of the Oneida Nation, we helped you guys fight in the War for Independence, and then after you won, you kicked us out. So it was our land. So who are you fighting? In the 19th century, settlers were moving into the southern part of the United States as well. They were coming more westward, so they were going into Alabama and Mississippi, and treaties were used to take land from Native Americans. One of the greatest adversaries that we have was Andrew Jackson. And on May 28, 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, and that removed us from our reservations. It gave him permission to grant unsettled lands to Native Americans west of the Mississippi in exchange for lands that were already in state borders. So you're already living in the area of Georgia. We're going to give you land west of the Mississippi, but you have to give us your land here. So there was a period of migration where some people did actually voluntarily go, and then there was some forced removal, and one of the forced removals was actually the Cherokee. The Cherokee fought it, though. They took their case all the way to the Supreme Court in a case called Worcester versus Virginia. They used Georgia. They used Georgia law that stated that white settlers couldn't live on Indian land without written permission from the state. The Supreme Court ruled in their favor. They said that they have a case, and absolutely, you're well within your rights to stay in that land. But the state refused to enforce the law, and Jackson wasn't going to make the state enforce the law. So he said, let them try to enforce it, I'm not going to. So instead he sends in military. So by 1838, 16,000 Cherokee remained on their land and refused to move. He sends in 7,000 U.S. military troops to make the Cherokee move, basically at gunpoint. They were not allowed to gather belongings, and their homes were looted by white settlers just as they were leaving. This was known as the Trail of Tears, obviously. And along the way, 4,000 Native Americans died of disease, cold, and hunger. A total of 50,000 Native Americans were moved off their lands, and that opened up 25 million acres of land to white settlers in slavery. But what they didn't count on is that we're still here. They didn't get rid of all of us. Okay. So, another way, thank you. Another way that they tried to get rid of us was while we were on the reservations, they decided they were going to break up the reservations, and that was called allotment, or the Dawes Act. Basically what that did is it focused on taking your reservation land and breaking it up into smaller settlements for each particular person. Anyone who was registered on tribal rolls were eligible for an allotment. There were some groups that were exempt from this act, and that was the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, the Seminoles, the Osage. Also the Seneca Nation of New York and the Sioux or Lakota Nation out west. But in 1893, this would change, and the Dawes Act would be opened up to all tribes, including the ones that were previously exempt. While this act was meant to protect Native American land, it did the complete opposite. The land that was allotted to us was unsuitable for farming. And they wanted us to be farmers because it was a way to assimilate into Euro-American culture. But not all Native Americans are farmers. Not all tribes practiced agriculture and farming. So number one, you either didn't know how to do it. Number two, the land that you had wasn't good for it. And number three, if you could do it, you couldn't afford the tools that it took in order to farm. It's not cheap to farm. Ask any farmer here. You guys are in Wisconsin. There are tons of farms. It's not cheap to farm. And they still weren't satisfied, and they still continued to take our land away. So a Kiowa chief by the name of Lone Wolf took his case to court. He was a Kiowa chief, and he was living in Indian territory that was created by the Medicine Lodge Treaty in 1867. This treaty had a particular clause in it when it came to land. The treaty required that 3/4 of all male Native Americans living in the territory had to agree before any changes were made to the territory. This was the Kiowa, the Comanche, and the Apache were all living together. So in 1892, Congress tried to make some alterations to Indian territory by opening up 2 million acres of reservation land to non-native settlers. Lone Wolf said, hold up, we have a treaty that says you can't do that. But if we all study history and we all know history, treaties don't mean a darn thing. So he took his case to court, he filed it, he went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, doesn't matter, Congress can void a treaty whenever they want. And it was the first time that the inferiority of Native Americans was put on paper because the judgment was made in the favor of the government. So we do have reservations today still, obviously. My mother was born on one, she was raised on one. Native Americans were forced to live on reservations for a period of time where you couldn't leave, you had to stay there. Now, later on, through different acts and all that, we can roam freely. But there are issues that are on reservations. There's economic issues. There is, poverty issues. If you were once a nomadic tribe, you couldn't be a nomadic tribe anymore. You had to stay on that land. Congress tried to help the problem, so to speak, but they never did. They always made it worse. Indian agents were put in charge of reservations, and too many Native Americans began to feel as if they were living in prison as opposed to being able to freely roam the land. So today on reservations, from what I have read and what I've talked to, it's not a matter of living, it's a matter of surviving. But they are surviving, and they are still there. Many people try to come together as a community to try to help survive. I mean, we're community people. There are high rates of unemployment, which create economic hardships, and depending on where your reservation's at, it can take you forever to get to a job. How are you gonna live? How are you gonna survive? But they're surviving, they're still there. You can find a sense of community, but sometimes it's too hard to find. But if you are with the right group of people, you can. My mom is Stockbridge, Muncie, and so her reservation is up north in Chicago, or Shawano. Why did I say Chicago? And it's isolating. I was up there for about 9 months last year, and it's very isolated up there. I'm used to Detroit, big city, everything all around, and being up there in the middle of literally nowhere felt very isolating. There was nothing there. The jobs that are relied on are the ones at the casino, and now while the casino does supply a lot of jobs, not everyone can have a job. And in order to travel to jobs, you have to have a car. Not everyone has a car. If you have a car, you have to be able to put gas in it. Gas is expensive. But they're still there, and they're still trying to survive. So even though we do live on reservations today, sometimes we are surviving the reservations. We are moving beyond. One of the other things that we had to survive, and that I had talked about when I was here in August, was boarding schools. They were first established in the late 19th and early 20th century as a way to assimilate Native American children into mainstream culture. The first boarding schools were set up by religious missionaries who would start schools on reservations. Later, the BIA funded more boarding schools that would be based on the Carlisle Indian Industrial School model. If you know anything about Carlisle, it was not a good place to go. Children were taken out of their homes and forced through cultural changes. They were given more Euro-American haircuts. They could no longer speak their native language. And their traditional names were replaced with civilized names. They also had to start practicing a Christian religion. There's nothing wrong with Christianity. I just don't want people to think I'm dogging on it. But that wasn't our religion. That wasn't their religion. Many times the treatment in schools was not good. There were cases of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse in the boarding schools. In the late 18th century, there was a movement to help civilize Native Americans. So we go back just a little bit. So in the 18th century, before the formation of schools, there was a movement to help civilize us. So the Civilization Fund Act of 1819 helped to promote the idea by funding mainly religious groups to work with Native Americans and build schools near reservations to help in the education of Native Americans. Now, it's not just reading, writing, and arithmetic. It was how to be white. By 1885, there were over 106 schools that were dedicated to the assimilation of Native Americans, and many times they were set up in old, abandoned military installations. There was a process that happened when you first arrived. So when you first got there, when you were first forcibly taken from your home, you were stripped of your native clothing, and then your hair was cut. Second, since most of the schools were run by former military personnel, you were given a strict schedule and you had to stick to it. So when I was reading some of this, it kind of reminded me of that experiment that you learn in psychology class, Pavlov's dog. You ring the bell, the dog went to go eat, right? In boarding schools, there were bells or signals or however you want it to make sure the children were doing what they needed to do at a certain time. So the bell would ring twice, you knew you had to go here. The bell would ring once, you knew you had to go here. They were set up like boot camp. They were a boot camp. From the moment you arrived at a boarding school, you couldn't be Native anymore. That was done. That was your old life. You had to basically give up those ways and learn how to act in a more Euro-American style. Tradition was gone, and many times young Native girls were retaught how to do things so that they weren't doing them the way that their mothers or grandmothers were doing it because it was wrong. So if you were learning how to make something and you said, well, my grandmother did it this way, they said, your grandma was doing it wrong, you have to do it this way. So you were relearning traditional ways of whether it was making clothing or food or what have you. Punishments were harsh. Carlisle was the worst for punishments. Carlisle is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Lot of Native children went to Carlisle. My great-grandparents went to Carlisle. And then my grandparents were in religious boarding schools here in Wisconsin. So if you were caught speaking your native tongue, your mouth was washed out with lye soap. You could be put in basically solitary confinement and just given bread and water. And oftentimes you faced corporal punishment for violating rules. These are children. These are tiny little babies who are being forced to learn a completely different way of life. When you were finally released from the boarding schools, or you graduated, or you ran away and were never caught, you were expected to return to your tribes and bring the knowledge that you just learned back to them. You were now the instructor. You now had to teach them the Euro-American style. But most of the time, when you showed up on your reservation, you were an outcast, because you were different now. You were dressing different, you were talking different, your name was different, your hair was different. The old ways were forgotten, and the new ways, you didn't fit in. But you then didn't fit in mainstream culture either, because at the end of the day, you were still an Indian. So you didn't belong anywhere. So that sense of belonging was gone. And because of that, the issues that we deal with today are even more prevalent. Post-traumatic stress still exists today amongst Native peoples in the forms of intergenerational depression. There's intergenerational poverty. Those are real things. Those are science things. You can look them up. I don't just make that up. I myself do suffer with a little bit of intergenerational depression. It took me a long time to figure out why, until I learned last year that my grandparents and my great-grandparents went to boarding schools, and my mother was raised by people who went to boarding schools. So they didn't talk about it. They didn't talk about being Native. They didn't talk about language. My mom can't speak the language. Her mother couldn't speak the language. I can barely speak English sometimes, so I really can't speak the language. I would like to learn, absolutely. So to those children who came out of those boarding schools and still survived and kept the traditional ways, I hear people who speak their language today, whether it is an Algonquin language or whether it's Menominee or whether it's Lakota. I say, where did you learn that? You speak it so beautifully, so eloquently. And they learned it from their parents, who learned it from their parents, who hid it while they were in boarding school. Didn't speak it when the teachers were around. They spoke it at home. So they kept the language alive. Language is such an important part of culture. When your language is gone, your culture is gone. Reservations, some people are saying, well, Why do you need an Indigenous Peoples Day? What's so important about it? You have your reservation land. Newsflash, that land is land we were forced upon. That land is land that wasn't always ours. The land that we have, the Oneida have land in Green Bay. We're from New York. If you want to give us our land back, you have to give us New York back. The Menominee, all of Wisconsin basically, the UP, the Ojibwe, all of Michigan. So yeah, we might have a little piece of reservation land, but it's not ours. And we don't even own it. It's owned by the federal government. We can't do anything with it. If my mother was to build a home on reservation land and she were to pass, God forbid that doesn't happen anytime soon, that land would revert back to the tribe. It doesn't even belong to us. So there's not, yeah, you've given us our land. That's great, but you haven't given us all of our land. The other thing that I get told sometimes too is, well, what are you complaining about? You have casinos. Yeah, we have casinos, which is great. Thank you guys all for going there and losing your money. You paid for my education. However, a casino is only successful on or off a reservation if it is in a populated area that has high traffic and that is frequented a lot. Casinos out west or casinos up north in the middle of nowhere do not make money. It is not equal across the board. I can walk, 2 years ago when I was out west, I was driving through the Pine Ridge Reservation. They have a casino. It's the tiniest little thing I've ever seen. And we drove past the parking lot, and it took me a minute. And I was like, that was a casino. There were 3 cars in the parking lot. That doesn't make it better. That doesn't, oh, you have a casino. That doesn't do anything. Where are the jobs? Where are the people coming in to help make that revenue? Not all tribes are the same. Not all casinos are profitable. And a casino doesn't pay for the past. It does not pay for the past. Thank you. I totally forgot that I had wanted to start this off by a quote, but I wanted to, because I think it fits in here. And if you heard me in August, you heard this quote then, but I think it's good because I just said casinos don't fix the past. In order to fix the past, you have to acknowledge the past. Yes. You have to realize there was wrong done. You have to realize that we were a country born in genocide. So this is a quote from the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I love it. It says, quote, "Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shore, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we are not permitted ourselves to reject or feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore, all exalt it. Our children are still taught to respect the violence which reduced a red-skinned people of an earlier culture into a few fragmented groups herded into impoverished reservations." Yes. People ask why I do what I do. Am I looking for something? Am I wanting something in return? I'm not wanting anything in return. I don't want people to say, "I'm sorry, I can't believe that happened." What I want people to do, Native and non-Native, because sometimes Native people don't know their own history. I was guilty of that for a very, very long time. Acknowledgement.
Yes, yes.
Acknowledgement that it happened. It did happen. We were born in genocide. We turned those people into slaves. We then brought more slaves over. We can be the greatest country in the world, but we can't be until we acknowledge our past.
Yes.
So thank you, Racine, for finally making this Indigenous Peoples Day. Thank you guys for coming out to learn, and I appreciate it, and I can't wait to speak with all of you guys again. Thank you.
Does anybody have questions, or would anybody like to speak?
the microphone here. I'm going to- Yes.
I just want to make a little comment.
Into the microphone.
Okay. Just a comment, as we're told tonight that the names are changed, their ways are changed, so that when we came to Racine, we are from Texas, and we came to Racine, Hispanics speaking Spanish, and are not eating white bread, eating tortillas, but we were told that our names are no longer going to be the same. My name was Maria Luisa. They changed it to Mary Lou. I was Mary Lou till I got to high school, then I dropped the Lou, it was just Mary. And it wasn't until I started working, got married, that I changed my name back to Maria, what it really was. But teachers, the good teachers and the good sisters, they thought they were Americanizing us. We did not realize that we were already Americans.
Right, right.
So this is one way of defeating us, of putting us down by changing our names and by forbidding us to speak our language. We got punished. Whenever we said something in Spanish, we asked a question in Spanish, there comes the rulers on our hands, pow. And we ask another question, the rulers come out again. So they also stole, first of all, they stole our native tongues. Then our Spanish tongues, where we lived in Mexico, spoke Spanish, but Texas, as you know, is part of Mexico, or many southern states. So we all spoke Spanish. Our teachers, our doctors, everybody spoke Spanish, so there was no real need to speak English when we were in Texas. Up here, we were told to go back to Mexico. I had never been in Mexico.
Right.
But as I said, that's very powerful when they can come and take our being away from us.
Hello, everyone. Just when I hear, I can remember my mother. Telling me about the many times that she would get hit across the knuckles because she tried to speak her language, which is Choctaw. And my grandfather was a teacher, and he was trying to tell the children, you can speak your language, but don't let the white man ever hear you or let them know that I told you that you could speak your language. Because as it was stated, you lose your language, you lose yourself. That is what is wrong with us people of color. I don't care what we call ourselves. I'm Seminole, I have some Seminole in me, I have Blackfoot and Choctaw. So I have lost almost everything. Because as I said, as you were talking, sweetheart, I heard Mom telling us about how the teachers would do them if they dare speak their language. Yes, and she get her mouth washed out in lye soap, not just soap. I don't know if many of you know about lye soap, but it was lye soap.
Regular soap is bad enough.
Oh, yeah, but lye. But lye soap because she was going to speak her language. So what you heard today, I've heard it too. It's in my family. And it's not a pretty sight. I guess I could say I got the double whammy because I am Negro and Native American. So you can get the double whammy, and it's not a good feeling. So as she said, all we're asking is for you to acknowledge, our white brothers and sisters, acknowledge what you did and what you're doing, what you even did to yourselves. It's not just to us, but to yourselves also. And it's coming back around. What you do, it comes back around. And we can see that with our president. We can see it. Thank you for listening to me.
Anybody?
Anybody?
Questions? Comments?
And I too am proud of Racine. I've been here a few years. I can't get used to it, but I'm proud of Racine for acknowledging Indigenous Peoples Day. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome tonight. We're glad that you're here, because you know what? Whether you know it, each and every one of us has got a little piece of Indian in us. Thank you. Somewhere or another, down the line, you've got different cultures in you that should be acknowledged. Not only that, you should be able to speak your language, wear your dress wear, go where you want, sit where you want, and be proud of who you are and what you are and where you came from. We have a right to know our ancestors before, now, and to carry on. See, we're not quiet any longer. We have a voice, and we are going to speak our piece. Because without us, actually, this would be pretty boring here, let me tell you. If we all looked alike, sang alike, everything would be boring. We are the people that make it perfect. Every color, every nationality, whatever you are, it's important for everybody to know a piece of everybody and to share, rather, your religion, your culture, your people. Stand up and speak. Make your voice heard. Okay? Just because you look black don't mean that you ain't Indian. Just because I look Mexican don't mean I ain't black. Just because you're white don't mean that you ain't German or Italian. But we are not God. Only God can judge us. Okay? So we are no longer shall be quiet. Now we will speak our piece and we're going to have it heard. Thank you.
Anybody else? I would like to thank all of you for sharing this very special evening together and to acknowledge together that we are on stolen land, that we are standing on blood-soaked soil, and it has to be acknowledged and mourned. It's a loss for all of us. But we go forward together, and thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.